A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So let's start the day with the discussing with the topics in the newspaper. The first topic we'll be discussing is about the West Asian crisis. So this can be asked as an extension of your world history in your GS syllabus 1, or it can be a standalone question in your GS paper 2 also, under how the US interventions policies of various countries are going to impact our relationship with various countries in the world. So whenever if you have studied world history, you know how the US and the other European powers have been intervening in Middle East and West Asia, and how that has actually led to divisions among the various countries in Middle East and West Asia, and that has led to eruption of a lot of violence in the region. In this context, you must have also studied about what is called as a Sykes-Picot Agreement. So whatever now we are discussing today as part of the West Asian crisis could be seen as an extension of the same, how even after so much of violence and so much of disastrous things that are happening in Middle East and West Asia, the powers have some of the important powers like the United States have not stopped intervening in this region. And because of their interventions, they are creating new dissensions and divisions in the region, which is again trying to divide the region, and in the future another fresh crisis may precipitate in the region. So this is what we'll be discussing, that what has been the impact of the United States intervention been on the Middle East and West Asian crisis. So we will discuss this under 4 different categories. The first is the disastrous interventions. So here you can give examples of the US intervention in various countries which has turned out to be very disastrous. For example, is the United States intervention in Libya, then in its intervention in Iraq was again disastrous, and even in the case of Syria, United States on the one hand and Russia on the other hand, they were supporting two different one was supporting rebels, one was supporting the government. So like that, they were pulling Syria apart into two different poles. So these were the examples of disastrous interventions that these countries, or US in particular, has been doing in the West Asian region. So this is about the disastrous interventions. Second is about destabilizing the peace. Now, the United States intervention in this particular region had started quite long back, starting from the reign of US President Dwight Eisenhower. So since that time, US has been intervening in one or the other countries in the name of promoting democracy in the region, or one or the other pretext. It has been intervening and it has destabilized the peace in the region. The recent example that you can give for this is the Iran issue. So US had signed a P5+1 deal with Iran, where some of the sanctions that were imposed on Iran were removed by the United States, and Iran's economy could flourish, but in return Iran would have some restrictions on its nuclear programs. So this program was working fine until the current dispensation in the United States under Donald Trump came into power. So Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew from this P5+1 deal, and it broke off this particular deal. And not just that, the US also levied many more sanctions on Iran, so that Iran's economy is going to collapse, and this was the intention of the United States. But however, this did not happen. In fact, Iran was so much provoked by this unilateral breaking of the P5+1 deal that it tried to emerge much more stronger and be a more influencer in the region. It started to attack the US troops who were stationed in Iraq through some of the rocket launches. So Iran started launching rockets and attacking the US troops in Iraq. It started to attack the Saudi oil fields also. So like that, Iran started to increase its weight in the region, and it wanted to defeat these sanctions that were imposed by the United States. So for this, Iran started further activities in the region, and it started to grow more stronger, and its influence in the region started to increase. So by this whole thing, there is a destabilization in the region, there is a disruption of peace, which was actually brought out by the P5+1 deal. Now, various countries, the neighboring countries of Iran, were very anxious about Iran's nuclear program. The P5+1 deal had done the right thing in removing the sanctions on Iran and also making Iran accept restrictions on its nuclear program. Now, with the unilateral disruption of this P5+1 deal, Iran is going now all the way out to enhance its nuclear program, which is again a great threat to the entire region and which is now destabilizing the peace in the region. So, this is a second example. The third is the embracing Israel. So, United States was following the policy of embracing Israel. So, no matter what Israel was doing, it was making illegal occupation of territories in the Palestine. But still, Israel was publicly embracing, US was publicly embracing Israel, and no word was spoken about Israel and the illegal things it was doing on the Palestinian territories. Even in the United Nations, all the resolutions were vetoed by the US, so that it always came out in support of Israel. So now what the United States is doing is it is now kind of supporting Israel, and also it is trying to bring the Israel and the Arabs closer. So in this context, you can quote about the Abraham Accords, about which we have already discussed in the previous ICANN videos. So Abraham Accords are it actually pertains to those accords which have brought the Arab world closer to the Israel. So this includes the establishment of diplomatic relations by UAE and Bahrain recently with Israel. So even though these countries did have back channel talks all these years and they were not really very much against each other, but now what the Donald Trump administration has done is to bring them on a public platform and say that the Arabs and the Israelis have finally become friends. So what the Israel has been doing is to what US has been doing is to embrace Israel and also bring the Arabs closer to Israel. So one example for that, as we spoke about, is the Abraham Accords, where UAE and Bahrain recently established full diplomatic relations with Israel and completely recognized Israel. So this way again, see, when Israel started illegal occupations on the Palestinian lands, and when Israel was set up, the Arab countries were very much against Israel. And as Palestinians were mostly Arabs, the Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, etc., they always wanted to support the Palestinian cause, that Palestine has to be an independent country and all the territories that Israel had illegally taken up from Palestine should be given back to Palestine. So all these Arab countries were actually very much supportive of the Palestinian question. But now with the Donald Trump administration trying to broker peace between the Israelis and the Arabs and bringing them together in a friendly relation, this Palestinian cause has now gotten diluted. So now UAE and Bahrain, for instance, have already established diplomatic relations with Israel. So this definitely amounts to a dilution of the Palestinian question that these Arab countries had upheld all these years. So this is again creating divisions within the Arab world. So where all the Arabs stood together and they always stood for the Palestinian cause before, now because of the US, some of the Arab countries have joined hands with Israel, and thereby they have left the Palestinian cause to die for itself. So the Arabs, between the Arabs itself, there have now created divisions and dissensions. This again is going to worsen in the future, and it may have a lot of negative consequences for peace in the entire region. So this is about embracing Israel. The last thing is about creating the vacuum. So now, as I said, that the Palestinian question has been diluted because these Arab countries like UAE and Bahrain have established diplomatic relations with Israel. But it doesn't mean that the Palestinian question is just going to die off, it's going to be just finished off. There are a number of non-Arab Muslim countries in that region who are trying to take up this question again so as to increase their influence in the region. Some of the examples of such countries involve Turkey and Iran. So we know we have a reason why Iran is trying to increase its weight in the region. Even Turkey, for that matter, under the President Recep Erdogan, is trying to increase its influence and weight in the region. Now, this Palestinian question will be taken up by these countries who are more aggressive. Even if the Arab countries have now given up the Palestinian question because of the US attempts to broker peace between Israel and Arab, these non-Arab Muslim countries like Turkey and Iran are going to take up the Palestinian question, and they may become more aggressive in it in order to increase their weight and influence in the region. So, what the US measure or intervention to establish good relations between Israel and Arabs has done is it has created a new vacuum. So, Arab countries are now not going to support the Palestinian cause, but we have non Arab Muslim countries like Turkey and Iran coming out in support of the Palestinian cause. So, this vacuum that has been created is going to be filled by more aggressive powers like Iran and Turkey. And again, these aggressive powers and what they may try to do to uphold the cause of the Palestine and how they may use a lot of aggression to increase their influence in the region can again, it depends on the future how this turns out to be. So, this aggression by these countries will again have an impact on the peace in this particular region. So, these are the four ways in which the US policy has impacted the West Asian region, and it might have long term consequences on peace and stability in the West Asian region. So, it will end up creating all the more divisions and dissensions in this region, which will make the region more volatile and a fertile ground for the non state actors like ISIS, etc., to emerge in these regions also because of the instability and the loss of peace that these types of measures may bring into this region. So, this was about this topic. Now, let's move on to the next topic. The next topic we'll be discussing is about manual scavenging. So, manual scavengers usually belong to some of the deprived communities and the backward communities. It can also be under your GS syllabus too, which talks about the vulnerable sections of population and the issues that they face. So now in this whole editorial, we'll be discussing about some of the issues related to manual scavenging. So first, to look at the basic timeline, you have to know that a civil society movement started in the 1990s under the Safai Karmachari Andolan and it campaigned so that the government will bring in a legislation to remove dry latrines in the country. So before that, a lot of dry latrines were existing in India, and these manual scavengers were expected, who particularly belonged to one community. They were asked to clean up the human excreta. So this inhuman practice was prevailing during that time. So this civil society movement under the Safai Karmachari Andolan was persistently campaigning for a legislation but that would do away with the dry latrines. So later on in 1993, a legislation was brought about to abolish dry latrines in the country. So further in 2013, a survey was done again on the insistence of this NGO Safai Karmachari Andolan under the leadership of Bezwada Wilson. So under this survey, again, it was found that even though the 1993 Act had banned and abolished the dry latrines in India, but still a lot of dry latrines were existing in India, and there was manual removal of human excreta that was happening. So therefore, this act was again amended in 2013 that spoke about providing land to these people, giving them vocational education so that they can have an independent living. So there were a lot of provisions, giving them loans at concessional rates so that they can do some other income generating activities. So these were the various provisions also that were included in the 2013 Act. But even to this day, we see that there are a lot of dry latrines that exist, unsanitary latrines that exist, and manual scavenging as a practice has not come to an end. So in this context, let's discuss some of the issues related. So first is, as the Act says, that there must not be any dry latrines constructed in India. But however, we still see that there are several dry latrines which are in existence, and this practice of construction of dry latrines itself has not come to an end. Second is, it is not just about the dry latrines or the wet ones, but rather it is also about the safety equipments which are being given to the manual scavengers. Many times these scavengers are asked to go down the manhole or sewers in septic tanks and to clean up the blockages. But that involves dangerous hazardous gases which would have been generated in the manholes. But these people are not given any safety equipments, be it boots or gloves or shields, headgear, masks, nothing are given to these people who do this job. So safety equipments is completely neglected, and the safety of people therefore who are manual scavengers are compromised to a very large extent. This has even led to the death of several manual scavengers while they were on their job cleaning the manholes, sewers, and the septic tanks. This is the second issue. The third issue is that even though we may not see much of dry latrines, but open defecation as a practice is still there in many of the corners, and also unsanitary latrines which are not clean. And even if these are latrines where through water you can flush it, but still making somebody else clean our excreta is completely inhumane, and it threatens the dignity of that person. So that practice is even today continuing. The next issue is lack of data. So government's own survey and the survey by the NGOs, they all point to different set of data about the number of manual scavengers who are existing in India. So as long as we don't even have a total tally of the number of manual scavengers, how is it that we will be able to deliver welfare services to them? How is it that they can be given all those services which come under the act, like training them, giving them occasional training, giving them concessional loans? If we do not have the exact number of data of manual scavengers, many of these are going to miss out on the benefits that come with these welfare schemes. The next issue is the stigma. So there is a lot of stigma that is associated with this whole job, and usually these manual scavengers are treated like untouchables. They are not even let within the premises of a building. So this lot of stigmatization is happening. And in India, not just about the cleaning of toilets, but even cleaning as a job itself is always looked down upon, that it is a very lowly job. So this is the stigma that is attached with the cleaning and cleanliness in India. So this stigma first of all has to go away, and people who are actually cleaning the mess out there should actually be looked up upon and not looked down upon. And the last issue is insurance. Now many of these people, as I said, are going down the manholes and they get suffocated in that hazardous gases down there, and therefore they are even dying. But there are no medical insurance policies to if they become injured in during when they are doing their duty, or if they even if they die. So there are no medical insurance policies to pay for the injuries that may happen to them during the performance of their job. So this concept also is now non-existing in India, which has to be provided to them. So these are some of the issues that were discussed in this particular editorial. And also I feel this topic can be very important topic, and it can any year it can come up as a question in your exam. So when I was preparing, I had watched an RSTV big picture video on manual scavenging, which I strongly recommend all of you to watch it, because it was the most informative video, and that covered the entire thing about manual scavenging from start till the end. And all that you have to, even your very good way forward is also provided in that particular video of big picture. And that was a very holistic and a comprehensive answer that comes out of that particular video. So I strongly recommend all of you to go and watch that RSTV big picture video on manual scavenging. So now we move on to the next topic. The next topic we'll be discussing is about air pollution. So air pollution and what is the impact of air pollution on health can be a part of the environment topic in your GS syllabus 3. Or if you're talking about the health and what are all the issues that might affect the health of an individual under your health topic of GS paper 2, then it might as well come under your GS paper 2. So basically the same piece of information can be used in both the papers. So recently the State of Global Air 2020, or also called as SOGA 2020 report, has been released. So this report talks about the impact of pollution on the health and the kind of deaths it is causing in India. So let's have a discussion on the important observations that the SOGA report to say. The first is about the infant deaths. So because of air pollution, nearly 1,16,000 infants have died in India in 2019. So this is the impact that the air pollution, severe air pollution, is having on the infants. So 1,16,000 infants have died just because of air pollution in India. This is the first data that you have to remember. The second is about the deaths of the adults from the non-communicable diseases. Here, non-communicable diseases could mean stroke, heart attack, diabetes, lung cancer, neonatal deaths, chronic lung diseases. All of these come under this category. So, from long-term exposure to these air pollutants, the number of deaths from all of these non-communicable diseases have been given at 1.67 million in 2019. So this is the number of deaths that have happened because of the air pollution in India, and these are of deaths have happened from these non-communicable diseases. And the last important thing you have to remember is about the ozone pollution. So ozone pollution is very severe in India, and India is ranking third in that, just after Qatar and Nepal. So the amount of ozone in the atmosphere, in the environment, is also rising very rapidly in India. Ozone, you should know, is a very harmful gas, and it can destroy the lungs tissues, and it can cause a lot of respiratory problems. It can worsen asthma and also cause chronic respiratory infections. So apart from being a greenhouse, or the gas that contributes to global warming. So these are the three important things that you have to remember. One, that it is causing 1,16,000 infant deaths every year due to air pollution. Second, 1.67 million people are dying because of the air pollution related to the cause being the non-communicable diseases like stroke, heart attacks, chronic heart infections, etc. Then third is that India ranks very high in the ozone pollution, just third in number, and what is the impact of ozone on our health. So these were the important observations made by the SOGA 2020 report that you can quote in your answers on pollution or on health. So now we move on to the next topic. The next topic we'll be discussing is about the virtual courts. So virtual courts, as another type of court for dispensation of justice, can be a part of your GS2 syllabus when you are talking about judiciary and the reforms needed in the judiciary in general. But virtual courts also involve a lot of technological resources, so that can be an example in when you're talking about technology, e-governance, etc. So that might come in your GS paper 3 also, when you're talking about technology and its utilization and its application. So basically, this Parliamentary Standing Committee on Personnel, Public Grievances, Law and Justice has submitted a report, and in this report it has said that these virtual courts which are currently being held because of the pandemic must also continue in future even when the pandemic is not there. That is, virtual courts must continue even once the pandemic ceases to exist. This is what the Parliamentary Standing Committee has told. And as far as virtual courts are concerned, previously in April or May, I think in the ICANN videos, we have already covered virtual courts, all the details about them. We have also discussed a full-fledged question on the virtual courts about their merits and limitations and all that. So in this editorial, we'll just be brushing up those concepts that we have already read. So those of you who have not watched, I would suggest you to go and watch that video. So these are all the various advantages of the virtual courts. First, that it is cheaper. So definitely, because a lot of procedural things will be cut down if you have to attend to a particular case from the computer system in your room itself. So therefore, it will be cheaper. So this will help a lot of the poor people who do not get access to justice. So therefore, this will make the justice delivery even more democratic. So it will be cheaper. Second, it is also going to be faster, again because of the right from your homes. It is possible for people to just interact quickly and then to do away with a lot of procedural things. So it is possible for us to aim at faster delivery, justice delivery. So now we already know that we have more than 3 lakh cases which are pending before the judiciary in our country. So therefore, if virtual courts is going to make the justice delivery faster, then definitely it's a move that needs to be welcomed. Third is the locational hardships. Now many people they think twice before fighting for their rights in the judiciary, because they know that if they file a case, then they will have to keep going to the court to attend the proceedings, and they may be situated in a different location. So all of this matters, that you have to go. If you have to file an appeal in the High Court, you will have to go to the place where the High Court is situated, and if you have to appeal in a Supreme Court, you will have to go all the way to Delhi. So there are locational hardships which are associated with such things. So rather, if we have virtual courtrooms, then it is possible for anybody to be able to access justice right from their homes and offices. So then these locational hardships will not come into picture. Next is the safety of witnesses. Many times the witnesses who are a witness to some of the crimes are really they belong to some of the vulnerable sections. So they might sometimes be threatened with life or threatened with jobs. So they might get a lot of threats. So through virtual courts we can protect these vulnerable witnesses and ensure the safety of the witnesses better than when it requires the witnesses to be produced physically before the courts. So this can also be ensured through the virtual courts. The last is greater access. Definitely, because now many of these petty cases will be there, like insurance claims or traffic issues. So these are those cases which are actually create a lot of pendency in our judicial system. So if there are virtual courts, then these smaller and petty issues could be resolved so quickly that there is a greater access to some of the greater access to justice delivery channels to some of the more important cases which requires more time of the judiciary. So that is how it can provide more greater access also. So this is about the advantage of virtual courts, but then there are also issues which can be divided into technological and non-technological. Technological, because virtual courts will definitely depend upon the internet connectivity that is established between the various parties, the lawyers, the judges, and the parties that are involved. So there will be several connection related issues. So many times it has so happened that lawyers have had to answer or attend the proceedings through their landlines because their network wasn't working. So in the landline there is no video also to see what's happening exactly and what is the emotions of people. So sometimes people have attended these court room proceedings through in their cars because the network in their home happened to be really weak. So there have been several such cases where the technology and the strength of the connectivity has had an impact on the holding of the virtual court proceedings. So as long as we have a robust technological architecture where we're able to support these live sessions or the live proceedings and good connectivity being established amongst all the parties, virtual courtrooms will not be that effective. So this is one thing that we need to ensure. Second is the non-technological issues. So in court, usually the lawyers need to stress the same point multiple times in order to see the reaction of the people who are accused or the victim in order to bring out a point. So this cannot really happen over the virtual court proceedings. Several emotions play a very critical role in driving the truth in the courtrooms, be it anger or remorse or guilt, sadness. So all of these are various emotions which human beings display when they are actually there in the courtroom. And through this video mechanism, the lawyers may not actually be able to see the emotions that the different people are displaying, be it the victim or be it the accused. So emotions actually tell a lot of things, which is the truth, which human beings may not outrightly accept it in the courtroom. So once, if the lawyers are not able to clearly see what kind of emotion a person is portraying, is displaying, then it becomes very difficult to even question and counter question the person. So this one thing is very tricky in the case of virtual courtrooms, because the video that we see is often always distorted and not so very clear. So it is difficult for the lawyers to make sure what kind of emotion some question has brought in the person, whether victim or accused. So these non-technological issues also are there with respect to the virtual courtrooms. So this was about the analysis of the virtual courts and their benefits and also the issues that they may face. Now we move on to the next topic. The next topic we'll be talking about is an example that can be quoted when you're writing any question on technology and innovation. So this of course is a part of your GS paper 3. So this is an example related to COVI-RAP. COVI-RAP is a diagnostic test that has been developed by IIT Kharagpur. So COVI-RAP is a diagnostic test for detecting COVID. So this has been developed by IIT Kharagpur. Now, why is this a very innovative solution for us? Because before this diagnostic test, we had two options. One is the RT-PCR test, So this used to take up a lot of time also in giving the result, but not just that, it required a very elaborate lab infrastructure, very expensive machines to be able to do this test. So this RT-PCR test was coming out to be very expensive and also more time consuming for the results to come. The next option that we had was the antigen tests. So antigen tests would give the results within a matter of minutes, but then they were not at all accurate. They used to sound a large number of false negatives. That means a person is actually COVID positive, but the antigen test is showing it as negative. So this we call as false negatives. This is what the antigen test was giving because it lacked accuracy. So now we have CoviRap, which is being developed by IIT Kharagpur, which is also accurate and is also not very expensive. It doesn't require to be done in a lab setting as is for the case for RT-PCR. It can CoviRap can even be done in open fields. It is actually comprising of a low-cost portable device which can be carried to anywhere and the tests can be done. And it does not, RT-PCR requires high level of skilled personnel to be able to conduct the tests, but the CoviRap tests can be done even by unskilled operators who can just operate it, which is very simple. And also CoviRap is kind of one umbrella testing unit. It doesn't just test for COVID-19, but it can also be used to test other infections like influenza or dengue, Japanese encephalitis, tuberculosis also. So for all of these also the CoviRap can be used. So this can be quoted as an example when you're talking about innovation, because IITs in the country are the premier institutions that are not just involved in giving quality education to the children, but also they are technologically advanced and they are also very forward as far as innovation is concerned. So this can be quoted as an example when you're writing about technology and innovation. The question that you will have to be writing for tomorrow is what is manual scavenging and suggest measures to end this in human practice. It's a 15-mark question for 250 words, and I have already given off the source to you. You don't have to run anywhere else for the source, just rely on the RSTV debate. And of course, if you have any other previously made notes, you can take your own notes, and nothing better to rely apart from your own notes. So go for your notes that you have already made and the RSTV video. So that's going to make a very comprehensive answer, I'm sure. And about yesterday's question that we had to discuss on the roadblocks in the defense indigenization in India. So I'm recording this at 6 and I have read all the answers that have been written till now, and I really found the answers of Hum Tum Ek Saath, Abhishek Nair and Rupal Srivastava really very nice and very up to the mark answers, and they are very standard answers. So good going, guys. So keep writing like this, and others also take inspiration from people who are doing really well and then start writing, take improvements. Just go through their answers and see what is it that you can improve in your answers, what is it that you can add little by little, and then make incremental improvements in your answers to make it very good. So this is it about that day's the defense indigenization question. So these were the answers that were really good, and the others can also go through these answers and try and write better answers in as and when we go forward. And apart from that, I wanted to just talk to you about the Chinese model in defense indigenization. So just like India also has a lot of defense PSUs, even China has a lot of defense PSUs. So however, China has been able to indigenize a lot compared to India. The reason why this has happened is because there is a lot of collaboration between the armed forces and also the private and the public sector units, which are making various equipments or making various devices for the defense purpose. So ultimately it is the PSUs which are developing the things, and then ultimately it is going to be used by the armed forces. So as much of integration between the two as possible is always best for indigenization purposes. Now for this, let's take the example of light combat aircraft that has been developed by HAL in India. So the Chinese model, according to Chinese model, what would happen is HAL would hand over the light combat aircraft to the Indian Air Force, and then after handing over, it is up to the Indian Air Force to make more incremental improvements and more productivity enhancements to the LCA would be the responsibility of the Indian Air Force. So once the basic design is got by the Air Force, it is up to the Air Force, because Air Force knows its requirements really well. So it is up to the Indian Air Force to be able to make the future upgrades or incremental improvements that it wants to on the LCA. Now, if Air Force needs to be able to do this, Air Force definitely needs to have that collaboration and partnership with HAL as well. So the synergy between the two is very important. The Air Force Chief must have the authority to coordinate the activities of HAL, of the other agencies, other PSUs which are working on this. So all of these PSUs and the Air Force Chief must be able to cooperate with each other, and the Air Force Chief must have the authority to coordinate the activity between all of these PSUs and the Air Force. So that is when the real integration is going to happen, and that is when the true indigenization is also going to happen. So depending upon the scope of the question, you can talk about the Chinese model, which is about basically better integration between the armed forces and the PSUs which are manufacturing the defense equipments for the armed forces. So that is it about the question discussion, and do write this answer as much as possible. And these were the other articles that were not really important. There was one topic which was about the digital payment superhighways. So though digital payment as a topic may be important, but I did not find really exam worthy content in this particular article. It just broadly spoke about the National Payments Corporation of India and about the UPIs that have come about. Initially how it started with the RTGS and NEFT, and now how we are proceeding towards the digital payment platforms. So but not something that is specifically related to digital payment, and so it's that quality content I didn't find from the point of view of exam, of course. So others were not important, or we have already covered, like Quad, etc. we have already covered. So that is it for today. Thank you.